Dr. Aleema Gray, how do you describe what you do?
I'm a public historian and I'm a curator. And I'm also the founder of House of Dread.
The first time I came across your work properly, probably many times before, but was the Beyond The Bassline exhibition at the British Library. And this inspired what the man then put up the aerials for. This kind of anger that I had in June 2024 when I started criticizing platforms about their representation of Black music. And I walked through the exhibition and I was like inspired, but I was like, all this stuff, I knew it was there. I knew like we were here doing things, but I didn't feel it around me as much anymore. I felt this like, I guess, air of like R&B and hip hop Blackness, which has kind of reduced our kind of temperature here in some way. And then when I walked through Beyond The Bassline at British Library, I was like, oh, we have been here doing this thing, not just since the 60s. You trace it back to 500 years. Why did you start with 500 years?
I think 500 years just represented an important conversation in terms of how we think about Blackness. I think one of the things that's Beyond The Bassline, particularly what we were trying to do, was to kind of present, I suppose, the instability of the word Blackness and Black Britishness. So 500 years, of course, is anchored by a very violent history, the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. But within that violence and within that tragedy, we wanted to kind of pull out the threads of like what makes, this particular space of England quite important to that narrative of like Black creativity, Black art, social, political productions. The idea itself actually came from Dr. Michael Riley, who heads up the Black Music Research Unit. So he came up with this idea of 500 years and kind of presented it to the British Library. And I came on board as the lead curator to pull together a narrative that can do exactly as you described. That can, start to bring forward, I guess, more important conversations about where we're at now, where we're going, impossibilities and possibilities, etc.
Because the previous history of the way, I guess, Black British music and culture is discussed here is just starts at Windrush, like nothing really before. Which kind of tracks with like, I guess, broader like recorded music and albums and pop music history. But there's all of this kind of leading up to that where we shape what comes before. You start with the story of John Blank. Can we like just talk about that briefly?
Yes. John Blank. We start with the story of John Blank because he kind of legitimizes this 500 years because it's like, you can't say we're going to curate a history of 500 years, but where's the starting point? And John Blank is the starting point. So what's really interesting about the story of John Blank, like much of the histories around the 16th, 17th, 18th century, is that we're dealing with a lot of fragments. So there's not really a lot of material that can account for the breadth and the depth of African presence during this period. But we have these little small glimpses, and John Blank is one of those small glimpses. So he is the earliest documented recording of a musician of African heritage in Britain. And we know he existed because he appears on the tournament roll in 1511. The tournament roll, you can kind of think of it as a kind of a celebration that was put forward by the royal family, King Henry VIII. So we see him appear, and then we see him again in other glimpses where he's like complaining about getting higher pay, etc. And those are the only things that we know about John Blank. But I think he represents such an important starting point for many reasons, not only because it kind of takes the story of Black British music from that post-Windrush era, but also because it's 1511 where we are dealing with. And this is really at a critical point before the transatlantic trafficking. So when we think about the first slave ship to leave Africa is like 1562 maybe, So this was prior to that rupture. And I think that's a very important thing to sit with in terms of like the interfacing of like Black people, African people's arrival, their role, their position within the space of Britain. And one of the things that I felt it was very important to do with Beyond The Bassline is to move beyond that kind of narrative of the victim. I think there's when we talk about Blackness, there's always this kind of strange thing that happens where it goes into this fold of the victim, or it goes into this fold of like Eurocentricity or, so I wanted to kind of remove that kind of idea of victimhood and actually think critically about like how do these people survive and navigate these kind of structures. What's really interesting about John Blank as well is that we start with him, so that's the 16th century, but then not now go on for the next 150 years. So there's in terms of like the presence of Africans, because of course this is, enters the trafficking, etc., etc. And so therefore a lot of this work that we're dealing with and a lot of the curating that we're dealing with is actually dealing with a lot of absence. And so this is where we have to bring in other archival material to kind of put forward those kind of conversations.
And do you think like a lot of other things from that period were just destroyed to like not uphold that there were Black people maybe here in the UK producing work and being part of the social fabric? Or like, what's your kind of read on that?
I think the reality is that, and whether or not it was intentional or unintentional, is that at a certain point when you look at, the violence, is that Black people were not humans. Africans were seen the same as cargo. So after that point, it becomes even more astonishing that you might have figures such as Ignatius Shansoro and George Bridgetower and other ones-on-ones that's kind of entering the spaces. So we show that at the starting point in Beyond The Bassline, where, because a lot of the exhibition was about space, it was about how engagement with space. A lot of people didn't realize this when they walked for it. There was a specific kind of curatorial approach of like, we start in the ocean. So you have John Blank, and then you might have George Bridgetower and Beethoven, and we have these stories, but then we also have this thing around the map. And so one of the things that I started with was this map that was put forward by John Dee, and John Dee is a person who coined the term empire. And he hands this map to Queen Elizabeth I. And during this period, maps was almost like, you can kind of see it as like the latest iPhone or whatever. So if you had a good map, it's like the new technology, So on the back of this map, when I turned this map over, it basically says, don't quote me, but it basically says we are going to colonize all of the people then. You know what I mean? And this was kind of signed off and approved by Queen Elizabeth I. So what that means is that we have John Blank, and then we have this moment of complete violence and rupture where Black people were not humans, they were cargoes. And through this rupture, through this fragments, through this displacement, through the plundering, we find ways to navigate and to innovate and to bring forward these kind of sonic traditions despite all of the isms and schisms. So I think that survival, the beauty of that, is something that can be traced throughout the whole of the history. So we see it come up in the ocean section, and we can trace that all the way up to grime, to jungle. We are surviving in conditions that wasn't necessarily designed to and for us.
Why do you think that, I guess, the simple story was told before of just Windrush? Like, is that just for ease or for brevity? For like, okay, there was obviously a massive influx of people here at that time, but do you think there was, I guess, a destructive kind of mechanism by institutions before to be like, actually, we're not going to talk about that because that's too dangerous, that's too hot, that's making us look bad?
Absolutely. I think, you know what it is? I think it's just like, I guess I'm reaching to a point where I just understand that it's just a lot of pain and there's a lot of discomfort. And there's also a lack of tools, you know what I mean, to be able to work with it in a way that is sensitive, in a way that is responsible. So I think as soon as you talk about, Blackness within specific periods, it becomes, as I was saying, like this kind of personal attack where people feel like, in this highly political, anxious climate, they don't want to be racist, or they don't want to be like, oh, I wasn't a slave, I'm reparations and da-da-da-da. So it becomes a very contested space. And I think it just brings about a lot of feelings of discomfort. And I think it reflects just, once again, as I was going back to, like, just a very word of Blackness, of like, what is it? What is it supposed to be? And how unstable it is, and how really this represents such a thorn in a lot of our ideas around community and multiculturalism. So I just think it's a multiple of different things of just not having the tools to be able to deal with it sensitively. And then also representation. So you have people like me who becomes a doctor of history. So when I'm in the archive, I'm able to like liberate these narratives and kind of actually bring new perspectives, ones that perhaps wasn't considered before. So I think it's a mixture of all of these things.
Now we're nearly 2 years removed from it opening. you, I guess, position these things to ask questions about all these things to the people? What have been the questions that people have asked you back? What have been the things that have, what's the feedback that's come back to you after all of that being out there now?
That's such a good question. Because I take my work very seriously, because as I was saying to you, is like there's an emotion to this. And, I speak a lot about grief, for instance, because to know love is to know grief. And so for me, like I was very, very, very worried about doing something that will hurt as opposed to help. And as I was curating it, as I was thinking about the stories, what to choose, what not to choose, what to show, what not to show. This is 500 years we are talking about. And then on top of that, I thought I was a, music fan. But I was proved very wrong that you have some music head, would die for it, I'm a historian, I'm a curator. And of course, I'm interested in African and Caribbean heritage. But when I was doing the research, I was like, Ross, some people, you can go to like Luton and find someone who has like, I don't know, Winifred Atwell's coat that he collected from the 1920s that was, it's a real serious thing that, there's a lot of music heads out there. So I realized that I love music and I have a little aux cord, but...
but it's just scratching the surface.
But yeah, exactly. So there was a kind of a huge fear, I suppose, that I had curating Beyond The Bassline, that I would get it wrong, or I would do something that would be quite damaging. But you know what? Very surprisingly, I had such a positive response. I was searching for the critique. Of course, there was people that was like, "Oh, you never put this," or "What about hip hop?" or and there's an impossibility there in being able to articulate the breadth and the depth. I think I was very, very early on, I knew that we'll never do justice to the story of grime, the story of jungle. But actually what I felt the space could open up was a space to have conversations about Wagwan in our real life as it relates to Black music heritage, Black music culture, Black Britishness and what it is, what we do with it.
Did you get a sense afterwards that there could be like 100 exhibitions posts, right?
Absolutely.
If there's like 500 years, there's like all of these different stories that are possible.
Yeah, I absolutely. Like when I was researching and when I was doing the curating and when I was, because of course the project was also about decenter in London as well. And so it was in Cardiff and Liverpool and all of them places there. So like, I knew that it had to, I knew that like there had to be like this element of it that would live on in different spaces. And I would hope that, and we've seen it as well actually, not to say that Beyond The Bassline triggered all of these things. I mean, maybe it did. But we see after that there's kind of like, there's been a lot of different exhibitions or pop-ups or whatever, where people's really thinking about the role of heritage within this. And I think that was like one of my big objectives, curating and taking on this like huge responsibility to think about, we talk about heritage, we talk about culture, but we don't really talk about heritage. So I wanted people to actually start to...
Can you give the difference between culture and heritage in your mind?
Culture is whatever you make it, and that's the double-edged sword of it, But heritage is what we inherit. Heritage is thinking about care. Heritage is thinking about ownership. It's thinking about preservation. It's thinking about intellectual property. It's thinking about archives. But it was always considered as something that I suppose is a bit boring and niche. You know what I mean? Whereas culture is seen as something that's active, that's always been iterated, that's open to all, access to all. Everybody can participate in it. And I'm not saying it as a way to kind of, downplay the importance of culture. But for me, particularly the background that I come from, I'm quite interested in the groundings of where we really are talking about in our real life. And I feel like heritage allows us a way to do that, to think about material culture, sonic culture, immaterial culture, you know what I mean? So does that answer the question?
Yeah, for sure. Can you give an example of immaterial culture? Because so much of what we do is, I guess, ethereal, this kind of like hard to describe. It's hard to pinpoint these intangibles.
Yeah, I think music,
Sure.
Music is that, but also feeling and emotion. I think sometimes when you go, the same feeling that I had when I went into the archive at the British Library and I looked at this map, of John Dee, the feeling when we did have in my spirit, I had goosebumps, because we hear of these things all the time, You know, it's like what you were saying with like, I know that these things existed, but you know, but in the archive is where you can really kind of start to reassess these lies, you know, that's been told, the things that's been silenced, the things that are not there. So when I look at this map and I think about me as a Jamaican, that my ancestors were trafficked, displaced and fragmented, but may I stand up in the British Library and I'm holding this map that was given to Queen Elizabeth I to colonize our ancestors. And I'm sat here looking at the curator of maps, and he's, you know, lovely guy, but, you know, English guy, very nerdy with the kind of, God, I hope he doesn't listen to this. But
he might say the same thing about you.
Might say the same
Black
thing.
woman, very nerdy, going through my maps.
And he was more looking at it from a kind of nautical lens. So he was like, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So for him,
it's not a people thing. It's
not a people thing. Right.
Yeah.
So for him, it was more about, oh, you know, Dr. Gray, I don't think you should show this map because we can't really see, you know, because the map is so old that you can't really make out the lines. And I was like, no, me want this map. This are the map. This are the thing. Because even the absence of the lines becomes an important part of the story. But just being able to like touch it and to see it and to have that emotional reaction, even as I'm speaking about it now, it's almost welling me up.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So I think that's the immaterial. And I think what was so beautiful about the job that I do as a curator is that you're really creating the conditions for people to encounter that. So when I was, you know, being in Beyond The Bassline, being like seeing how people engage with the material, particularly in the first section, which I thought perhaps would have been the most boring, you know? Most people probably want to go see the sound system them and, you know, grime and da-da-da-da. But actually, most people spent a long time in that first section where we're talking about, you know, 15th, 16th century, because it's for the first time this encountering these materials. And I'm seeing young people with tears. I'm seeing, you know what I mean? So like, for me, that's the emotion and the feeling, and much of the work that I do is about feeling my way through and thinking about how we can bring forward that feeling within a historical kind of framework.
I think there's a payoff as well when, I guess, you engage with things that are so painful, like slavery. It doesn't lead you to joy. You know what I'm saying? So when people enter the exhibition, you're in the ocean and you're reading these maps and seeing the kind of brutality, but then it goes into music,
right,
and culture and dress and color and all these things, and it kind of brings it to life. Whereas if you go to something that is just straight violence, you're like, okay, you're gonna come out kind of horrified. I think like having that kind of duality was like kind of beautiful.
Yeah, and I also think it's about language as well, you know? I was very intentional within that. A lot of people didn't read these damn labels, you know? But you go to an exhibition and you spend so much time writing these labels and making sure every word matters, you know? I appreciate the people who actually took the time to read it, because that took a lot of time to like make sure you're doing your due diligence. But like I was very intentional about the certain words that we're using, you know, not saying slavery when we don't need to say slavery, not keep on reinforcing that. And actually the thing is not, as I said, it's about survival, it's about innovation, it's about how we continue to experiment, to navigate, to all of them things there. And this is what makes it so beautiful and powerful, this tradition that we've inherited. And for me, these traditions, these are the only things that we have. Our memories have been plundered, our names have been taken from us, all of them something there. So therefore, we're still there. And it's so beautiful and profound. So for me, that was the emotion that I really wanted to put forward. But I recognize that within an institution like the British Library, it's very difficult, especially because when you think about the role of a curator, we're really thinking about audience, you know? And the audience that's typically within these spaces are not necessarily the audience that I'm in conversation with. So a huge part of the work is also about being unapologetic in this thing, yeah? I'm speaking with, not even to, I'm speaking with the people them. And when we say the people them, I'm talking about people of African and Caribbean heritage. And it's not to say that, you know, that I didn't have a lot of like, you know, white women in their 60s, like really like loving the classical music section and being like, oh, my aunt did this and da-da-da-da, and I was a theatre performer and all of this stuff. But it's like decentering that and recentering like the conversations with African and Caribbean heritage people. So I think it's, as I said, it's a bit of a guerrilla warfare tactic of really being intentional in the work.
How different would it have been if you were making something permanent? Like it was there for 3 months, right?
Yeah.
So if it was going to be somewhere for 5 years, for example,
Oh,
like how
God.
different would the curation have been?
That's such a good question. I don't know. I don't think exhibitions should be permanent, though.
Okay.
I know that there was a lot of calls afterwards for it to be a permanent exhibition. But for me, sometimes it's about planting the seed and then seeing how it might inspire. And, you know, sometimes these things are part of what Stuart Hall would call like a kind of conjunctural moment of like just these forces coming together and kind of interacting with each other. But it would have been different. I probably would have put a lot more emphasis on the contemporary space within the exhibition. There probably would have been less commissions. So there was a lot of commissions. We worked with a lot of artists. But relatively, it probably would have been the same, to be honest.
Is this what you mean by practicing history? You're the first person I've heard use this term.
Yes. So for me, the practice of history is for me, history's a doing, you know? And I always used to get frustrated growing up. Or particularly when I knew that, yeah, man, history is my thing, you know? So I'm gonna go university and I'm gonna become a doctor of history, blah, 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 blah. When people's like, oh, but that's in the past, like that's boring, da, 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 da. Because when we're in at the community, which is my first entry point to history, you know, community centers and you know, supplementary schools and all of that kind of stuff. Like there's a different way in which we do history. You know what I mean? You might be at the barber shop and it's history I go on, you're debating, you're talking about what go on in Ukraine or Palestine or whatever. So for me, history is this like active force of it's not just about the past, it's really about, you know, engaging with the now, engaging with like the possibilities of the future. So the practice of history is this kind of working with these different material and immaterial things and putting it in a position where you're having a conversation with a particular audience. And it just so happens that my conversation, the audience that I'm having a conversation with is Black people.
You use the word curator. Is that, you know, this gap between like curator and curating, like the verb and the job?
Uh-huh.
I kind of use this the same with like DJing. So I'll say you could be a DJ, which is like the job of it, like the people that go and play, you know, gigs and do things publicly or play shows all around the world or whatever they're doing with it, yeah? And then there's DJing, which I think is a verb, which is like collecting music, curating things, mixing for yourself mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see the same as with curating? Because I think it's like one of those words that you see people appear in Instagram bios. I'm a curator. I'm like, okay, what are you creating? Or where do you create? But I think it's such it's a nice word to use, but like what's the difference between like being a curator and the job of it versus just creating more generally?
Yeah, I think even that's a good point. I think even within the term curator, it means so many different things for so many different people. I think you have the idea of like an institutional curator. So for some people within the traditional kind of perspective, they will probably look at the work that I do and not see that as curating, you know, or the traditional forms of curator. So when we think about people in permanent positions at an institution like the British Library, they have a particular responsibility to a collection. So they are, I suppose, custodians or stewards of materials, of collecting different pieces, of putting forward a particular narrative. Whereas others might just be exhibition curators, which is kind of like I probably like span both. Of if I'm at an institution, I'm doing kind of a little bit of both. But I think ultimately it is about creating conditions for people to encounter different understandings of who we are and what we know. And so, you know, being a DJ is part of that. Activism can be part of that as well. But I think the element with curating is that you are pulling things together to tell a particular story. But this is not just storytelling. It is also about thinking critically about the conditions of how people are engaging with the things that you're bringing out and how within that moment, it's going to sound really conceptual. Sorry if I'm getting a little... Within that moment, you're also creating new knowledges,
yes.
You know? So this is why a lot of DJs are now, you know, there's an element of curation that's happening there. When you're on the dance floor, there's something that's happening in that moment that a new knowledge is being created, that a new immaterial or material condition is being produced. And so for me, that is a core part of curating. But I think we're living in such a society at the moment where every new week someone is a archivist or a curator.
Okay,
or
what's the
whatever.
difference between that and an archivist?
So I think they overlap a lot. I think a traditional archivist, like when I think about to be an archivist, you go back to the etymology of the word. The etymology of like archivist is like, commencement and commandment. And this is really about like the starting and the having a command over a particular thing. And this is why it went so hand in hand with the idea of the nation state. So you're looking at the archives went hand in hand with this idea around like Britishness and what it is.
Yep.
But what we see happening, of course, is that more time people have access to their own forms of like collecting and their own forms of like, thinking differently about like material culture, et cetera. But essentially an archivist is collecting for a particular purpose. You have to have a purpose. It's not a hoarder. There's a difference between a hoarder. Like there needs to be a particular purpose as to why you are collecting. And these things that you're collecting could be very like different formats or whatever, but there's a core purpose to it. And the purpose might be about, Black music, or it might be about, I don't know, pop culture or whatever. But there needs to be this core thing. It's not just for the sake of retention,
Did you get the sense that, when you're putting together an exhibition or an event, when you do work at House of Dread, that it's got to sell as well? Like you got to get people through the door. Like what considerations do you make in your curation and the kind of curatorial process of like, okay, this idea will get people out of their house and into the exhibition or into a dance or into a talk or whatever it's going to be? Like how early does that come into your ideas?
I never really think about that. Yeah, I feel like there's always someone else thinking about that. If anything, I feel like sometimes that interrupts the depth a little bit. And maybe it's a privileged position that I feel like the work does the talking. People will come, the right people will come. If they're interested in the narrative, if they're interested in the story. And that's who I'm interested in with having a conversation with. So luckily, I've just been on this role where everything that I do, I never really struggle to sell a ticket or I never really struggle to da-da-da-da-da. Because for me, I focus on what the conversation is. Like, what's the questions that I'm asking? How we're being intentional. I'm doing the due diligence of the research. I'm not just doing it for the sake, you know what I mean? Chronics, we're not doing it for the, like, we're doing it for the, you know what I mean? In our real life. So, like, for me, I've never really had to consider it in that way. And which is also a challenge sometimes because when you own or when you founded your own business, you're having to think about sustainability and resourcing and all of them things. I'm very bad at that, and I'm getting to a stage in my career where I'm having to think about content producing and da-da-da and how you're like interfacing the work that you're doing, which is really grassroots in its function with capitalism and the fact that, most of these platforms that was established with a kind of community or civic function, they don't really survive, unless they pattern up and think about how to fold into a capitalistic kind of machine.
Do you think that though? Do you think like a lot of our ideas and maybe the way we organize is good to be temporary as well? Like some of the moments, okay, like you start House of Dread or I start Butters or wherever it's going to be, it's like that exists for a particular period of time and it documents, say like whatever, 76 to 87 when you're doing a particular thing and then you move on and then that thing has a new platform because it's a different organization of a group of people rather than just, I guess, our institutions of sorts just continuing for 150 years, like say like the V&A or something. It'd be like, okay, it's not actually Victoria and Albert organizing the things, you know what I'm saying? It is different people that have continued that thing over the years, whereas we start afresh and get fresh perspectives back and forth,
Yeah, I think it has to probably be a bit of both, I feel like some things are good in that particular moment and it's okay to have that as a particular memory, and as I said, it kind of like how Beyond The Bassline was temporary, but it lives on in so many different ways, but I think when it comes to like institution building, I think this has always been a challenge within, specifically our African and Caribbean grassroots Black British space, is that we actually need these spaces. We need these institutions to survive because we are putting a foot here saying we're Black British. So where do we go? British Library, V&A, maybe. But actually, we need these spaces because actually, when you also think about the history, it's really interfaced with like the spaces in which these music was being produced. And so what we're having is this crisis because there's not an access to an institution or these spaces, an institution with a lowercase I.
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily talking about, so like, I think, so for me, I think there has to be both. And when I think about my own, studio or whatever, maybe in 20, maybe I'm going to change 5 years time and be like, that was a good thing, but no, me depend something else and that's fine. But I think it's important for us to have something that's kind of like rooted and sustained that can be nurtured and grown. So I feel like it has to be a bit of both.
Is the term Black British fluid as our demographics change?
For sure. I think when I think about my father's generation, who was born in the 50s, he probably could never have conceived that there would be one day, that people will be affirmed, that you go to a football match, for instance, and because I feel like football as a space is really interested in understanding the intricacies of like race and politics and class. But he probably wouldn't fathom that there would be one day that you have black, white, that's all kind of supporting Arsenal or whatever, So, or he wouldn't fathom that you would have people celebrating and embracing this term that when he was a child, he was never allowed access to, So definitely, I think it's changed, but I think here's where the trouble is it's change and there's a fluidity, but the conditions remain the same. Like diaspora, when we understand the function of a diaspora, if we're looking at Black Britishness as part of a diasporic story, it evolves, but the conditions of a diaspora doesn't necessarily change. And that is what I'm quite interested in, like kind of resurfacing and bringing out. So we really are talk about now when we really mean Black British, what are the conditions that we're really interrogating here? What are the structures that goes back to the institutions? What are the conversations about ownership and care that we're foregrounded in our work? And I think when you look into the history from way back in the 16th, 17th century, these are the things that remain the same. And I think it would be more helpful for people to think, I found it more helpful at least. I can't tell people what to do. But
yes, you can.
But I found it more helpful to think within those terms of like, what are the conditions that's making this moment possible? And especially those of us, I've been talking about it a lot. I've been ranting on my Instagram recently.
Rant away.
But I've been ranting a lot about, those of us who are putting ourselves in this position of cultural producers, knowledge producers, curators, whatever you want to call it. How are we attuning to this system of care, to this system of the conditions that we're living in? And how are we pushing that forward, like in our real life,
What can we do better?
I think what we can do better is ask better questions. Number one.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry. No, but I think we need to ask better questions here, I also think what we could do better is also draw on what, Rastafari would say, unity and not uniformity, and what is our collective principles. I think there's a real destruction of collective principles now. We don't know what going on anymore. Like, what are we collectively agreeing to? If we're going to say Black Britain as this term, or Black Britishness, is there a collective framework around this, or are we going around in a kind of loop,
Or worse, like copying our politics from like America.
Right, exactly. So like, I think there needs to be a kind of collective framework. That doesn't mean that me and you, even though I'm British, maybe. Even though I'm British or we're British, we intersect in different ways. You were born here, I wasn't necessarily born here, but still there's a collective principle. So
Sure.
I think we really need to start putting together these kind of collective principles so that we can have this unity and not necessarily uniformity. I think we really need to start thinking, God, I sound like I'm going for Prime Minister or something. We really...
Bring on.
We really need to start thinking about intellectual property. It's something that particularly the Caribbean community has done really bad. We don't think about intellectual property a lot. We don't think about ownership a lot. We just create it and it's like, it's for everybody. It's our pie. I feel a thing.
If you think about that in the ownership and the IP in the first place, then they would make something different.
True.
So because people have been open source, free and contract, no contract, wherever it's going to be, certain things got made that would never have been made anywhere else.
True.
One blessing.
All right.
The curse is that it's going to participate in this society here, which needs contracts and it needs law and it needs systems. And if you don't have it, they're going to take advantage.
Right.
So that's the history, I guess, of Jamaican music here. Is
For
that,
sure. Yeah.
You know, it's participating in a system that it's not from the place that came from. And it's going to be like, okay, you don't want to make money? I'll make it then.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. And I think that for me reflects like what I understand when I think about the Caribbean as a region, because if we want to understand like the politics of like specifically the Black British Jamaican experience, there's an element of understanding like what like the Caribbean as a space, like historically and also in terms of like the now. And if we understand the Caribbean as a space of like, as I was speaking to, like fragments, but also relationality, like the Caribbean is made up of a lot of dispersed, small, little islands. But at the same time, it's been disrupted by so many different kind of colonial regimes. But the history of it, unlike other spaces where you might look at, you know, South American or even African American, like the Caribbean, in terms of inheritance, has been so displaced in terms of sonic traditions and cultures. But then there's also this idea of just being relational, which is why you would have the soul man, they must string up them. Nah, they're not thinking in those terms of like, I feel we think. Because it's just always about, you know, interfacing with various different communities, South Asian, indigenous, etc., Chinese, So because of that, it's just produced a particular kind of like negotiation skills that not really not there. So I think there's an optimism there at the moment where I think there's something that's happening at the moment where, you know, you have those who are in the position to do so, thinking about Jamaican IP and Caribbean music platforms and like what this means within a broader kind of local, global perspective. But I just think we've got a long way to go. But I think that by design, it wasn't really, as you said, designed for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think about this a lot when people speak about Jamaica in particular. And its influence on the music here is more like a historical thing. It's old school. They think of reggae as something that happened. Dancehall is something that happened. It's like a previous era's thing. And now it's like Afrobeats. Like it's like a trend. Like I'm like, no, the people are still there making music. It still exists. It's happening. What do you think like, I guess the modern relationship is with Jamaica and the UK or London in particular?
I think there's a lot of hope. I'm holding on to the hope. There's a lot of good people that's doing good things, trying to resurface the landscape or reconnect the landscape. But unfortunately, I think the reality is that, once again, I see as there's like, I suppose a lot of pain historically. So you would find that when I'm in Jamaica, for instance, I find that there is a complete lack of, surprisingly, for how popular Jamaica is in the context of Britain, I feel like there's an absence there in Jamaica of like a kind of UK diaspora who comes back and returns, you know? And I question why that is. And in questioning why that is, I realize that it's the ways in which the Caribbeans who arrived here, predominant numbers in large figures who arrived and became kind of interface with this system, this Babylonian system, you know, and had to leave behind certain things. And there's a lot of like, you know, intricacies of the stories of you have like a sister that them call for the sister and they call what. There's all of this barrel children's story and all of this kind of stuff. We've inherited a lot of the fragments and those pains and that pain. So the ways in which we connect to, I have certain friends that's like, they're like, oh, Aleems, I'm going to come visit you. My mom has never been, you know? And when she thinks about Jamaica, she's thinking about it as like, them I got tea for money or maybe they only return to Jamaica if there's a funeral or, you know? So, but I see it as rooted in a lot of the kind of pain and the sufferation that's occurred as a result of British Empire and as a result of these kind of forms of displacement. Because when we compare this to the US Jamaican diaspora, they have a very different relationship with Jamaica. Because once the UK closed their roots in like the 70s, 80s, then most Jamaicans started going to, you know, the US. Their networks, there was a kind of sense of responsibility of a network. And also, obviously, there's a proximity there in terms of it's not as expensive to fly, et cetera, et cetera. So there there's more of a kind of network there. Whereas in the UK, the UK for me, the British imaginary of Jamaica is almost like it's just ended. There's a nostalgic loop there, and it's frustrating, of course, as a Jamaican who has that one toe in Jamaica and one foot in London. There's a frustration there, but I'm trying to channel that frustration into okay, what's actually possible. I feel like UK people need to show up more.
Yeah, I think there was an example where we I guess people tried like last year with the crisis with the hurricane. So there was a moment where collectively, like even the music industry and the culture industry at large was like, we should support Jamaica in this time of crisis. Do you think there was things that we could have done better or collectively better that would, I guess, improve the conditions more for like people in Jamaica long term, rather than say like just sending barrels of things or collecting money? Like, is there something that's just missing in terms of what we can bring?
Yeah, I think definitely. I feel like we have I think it's amazing to see how positive the response was, the collective response was. I think it's the first time that we've probably seen that, actually. And I'm not sure if it was social media or what. There was a lot of people mobilizing and understanding that there's a kind of global responsibility, particularly within the UK. But I think there's also just a element of like showing, like actually going to Jamaica would be a good thing. You can book your flight, or you can go Jamaica. When you go to Jamaica, to try and potentially like stay out of the all-inclusive, to try and engage in a listening, particularly if you're a creative. There's such a, vibrant creative scene in Jamaica. Like reggae music continues, life continues. You have trap dancehall and whole heap of things that's happening. And, Jamaican people are so, proud and we're big and we're Talawa and all of them something. So for me, it's just like, I think we need to start engaging physically with the space. We need to start showing up and going there, seeing what investments can be made, seeing what gaps there is. House of Dread, we're opening a studio space there this year. When I say studio space, like our residency is a space to think forward, where we can invite different researchers and thinkers and collaborators. But I think we need to start investing, thinking about where we're investing our money into that space. Because if we're not doing it, somebody else is doing it. And that person who's somebody else is typically not necessarily have a historical, ancestral kind of investment within that space.
Yeah, when people say maybe it's expensive, what would be like a good pushback to that? Because
that's a reality. It's expensive.
It's just expensive.
It's teeth, Nora. Yeah. It's teeth. Yeah. It's very expensive. But it depends what you're doing. I'm from Portland, so like I'm from like the mountain community. But Jamaica is very expensive, and I'm not saying come to Jamaica as this kind of romantic thing. Jamaica have a heap of problem. There's a frustration there. Hence why it has one of the biggest. It has the biggest brain drain. I think, and it's a huge problem. Like people are actively looking to leave.
The smartest people are leaving like regularly, like to go to America, basically.
Exactly.
For the most part, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not an easy space to kind of crack, but there are people who are cracking it.
Yeah.
And I think it is possible, but I think for the most part, this is not me trying to romanticize this idea of returning to Jamaica and buying land, because it's really hard. As I said, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of bad mind. All of these things is a huge challenge within the region. But I think for me, if you're putting yourself forward as a creative that's inspired and anchored by Jamaican traditions and culture, I do think there's a responsibility to kind of show up, to listen, to see what go on. Maybe something is possible, maybe nothing is possible. But I think I'm quite heavily invested in kind of creating these global kind of connections.
Is that the same reason that our music never connected back there? So I guess the later bit of the exhibition is talking about garage, jungle, grime. And these are music that you won't really hear in Jamaica, even though they're so heavily influenced by Jamaican music and Jamaican people and of the children of the people of the island. But there's not music that you would actually hear in Jamaica. I said this to a friend, like they asked me, the jungle things in Jamaica must go off. I said, there's no jungle party in Jamaica as far as I know.
Yeah, no, there isn't. There might be now. I think recently there's been, especially because I think during COVID, a lot of people started looking at leaving America, Okay. So there's a kind of vibrant expat community there that's starting up different pockets of house nights, etc., etc. So maybe it might be a slightly different now. But I think that return back was never really a dream that was fulfilled. I think the generation of Jamaicans that entered Britain, entered and became so tormented by the reality of what it means to be here. But also there was a lot of feeling of shame because for a lot of people, they left Jamaica with this dream of, with the dreams that wasn't really fulfilled. And they can't go back to Jamaica without having something to show for it. And that something to show is an educational attainment, is whatever. It didn't really fulfill in that way. So I think because of that, we have this complete loss of a circular kind of, iterative, in the ways that you might see it show up a little bit more when thinking about the West African kind of demographic. Jamaica, there's a complete break there. But once again, once we understand the region and once we understand the histories of the region and the fragments and the plundering, then it makes sense that we're 3 times displaced. So we come here, we put down, we stamp, we suffer, we fight off a heap of races, white boys and teddy boys and all of them something there. And we survive and we continue to survive. But it comes at such a heavy cost. And that cost is that we don't have a lot of elders, that I interview, that I worked with for my PhD, is like, they're still saying, yeah, man, me, I go back and da-da-da. And they die here in council flats, and it's a grief. That's what I'm saying. So it's like, it's for me, when I think about the Black British Jamaican story, is this profound conversation of beauty and tragedy, in conversation with each other. So I think that's the reason why jungle music, doesn't resurface in Jamaica. But even as I was saying, even Lovers Rock, then no rock steady, but Lovers Rock, if you're playing, what is the song name?
Silly Games.
It's Silly Games.
Yeah.
How do you know? See, like if I played Silly Games to the people them down the road where I live, they probably wouldn't know that song. Surprisingly, for how big that song is. So I think. I think it's a product, and it was by design of the divide and rule that was in place.
Do Jamaicans have a sense of like their influence in the rest of the world? Like every country I visit, you see a Jamaican flag somewhere, or Jamaican food, a picture of Bob Marley, something everywhere. Do you get a sense that like people know that, or they're proud of that in a way?
I think it depends. I think the Jamaica that I'm speaking about is a very rural Jamaican countryside. Okay. I think definitely people in more like, Kingston would be aware of it. And especially with social media, and you going on TikTok. TikTok is very big in Jamaica, so they'll be able to see that, Jamaican is showing up. But I feel like for the place where I'm from, which is very remote and perhaps represents 70% of Jamaica, country, one road in and one road out kind of thing. I don't think they understand the breadth and the depth of just how profound and how much Jamaican culture has traveled, Even when I think about Rastafari, as a culture, as like one of the first kind of popular exports, that their locks, the Bob Marley, the this and the that. Like, I'm not sure if they realize just how transformational this small island has been in terms of our understanding of like the Black diaspora, in terms of popular culture. Okay.
You see, you keep saying that you're, I guess, from the country in Jamaica. Have you been into the country in the UK now? Like, have you been able to spend time in rural England?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. I had an aunt who's, she's passed away now. She lived in Suffolk and Norfolk.
Okay.
And she was actually an MP. She was part of the first MPs to be nominated in the 1980s. Her name was Sharon Atkin.
Wow.
But she decided to become a nun, and she gone up in the countryside.
Wow.
And then she has a very profound story. So I spent a lot of time with my aunt who lives in Suffolk and Norfolk, and then she moved to Norwich. But outside of that, no.
What did you learn about the UK from that perspective? Like, I guess like a lot of people just came here and arrived in the city. Most of us are in London. Never really ventured out. What did you learn about like English people and Englishness?
I think that I feel like for me, if you want to understand England, that's where you need to go. Mm-hmm. Remember Emmerdale?
Yeah.
I always tell people, watch Emmerdale. You want to know what going on in England? Watch Emmerdale. Not EastEnders, Emmerdale. In terms of like how diverse voices shows up in those spaces, I think it's quite interesting. And I often find when I interview a lot of people that are from a kind of more regional spaces like Bath or, you know, there is... I would say there's more of a optimism around race relations because there's such a... They're not interfaced with it. So it becomes almost like, oh yeah, you know, we used to play football and da-da-da-da-da. So it's not so antagonistic. That's what I find anyway, when I'm in those kind of spaces.
And a lot of Black people there will want to seek out information in a way that it feels maybe natural here. Like people feel like they know everything here because they're around Black people all the time.
Right.
Whereas when you're not, people go and make the effort. And maybe they're the ones that are going to Jamaica, or they're the ones that are going through the archives, or they're the ones that listen to the music and producing the knowledge to the people that should have kind of closer access to it here in the British Library, for example.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I think, let me know.
No, go ahead, please.
I think that's also like, it goes down to like, I'm quite interested in like the politics of representation and what becomes represented back to you and what we start reinforcing as part of that representation. So I give you an example, is like, the same as me knowing, say, my mother and my father's Rasta, you know? And when I'm in the pub or whatever, and when someone says, oh, so tell me about Rasta, what's Rasta? And I might say, one love. When I know that's not Rasta. But because this is what's been represented, and this is the narrative, and it just becomes easy to just say, one love, you know, but Mali, yeah, that's Rasta. And I think this happens in London a lot, where people are around a lot of this kind of represented narratives. And so we, without even knowing it, start representing things that are actually quite problematic and are actually quite surface level research. And so for me, sometimes I find that when in areas that's like outside of these spaces and places, there is that kind of slow work of thinking differently or thinking otherwise about the narratives that we tell ourselves.
Okay, I'm buying you a pint, and then can you explain what Babylon is?
Wow. Okay, depends. Have I drunk the pint? No, I'm joking. Babylon, woi. Okay, so Babylon actually has biblical foundations. So a lot of people don't realize that Babylon was, you know, part of ancient Mesopotamia or modern day Iraq. And so Babylon comes up in the Bible as this kind of place of like exile during the fall of Jerusalem. I'm not going to get into all the religions and the isms and schisms, but I think it's important to frame it in that way because it also shows it up again in the book of Revelations, where it becomes almost like a framework for what we think about capitalism, because there's a lot of distorted truths, there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of acceleration of growth, etc. So Rastafari have, like most of what Rastafari do, kind of draw on this kind of lexicon, biblical lexicon, and they've used this as a way to think about, you know, their own displacement in terms of the broader transatlantic trafficking. So the easiest way to understand Babylon within what most people would understand it as, which is more of a kind of far-right, you know, born Babylon thing, is a system of confusion. Is a system of confusion that's designed to keep people within a position of oppression, and particularly people of African and Caribbean heritage. It is best understood as the epistemological and the ontological violence. And when I say epistemology and ontology, I'm talking about what it means to know and what it means to be. So it's a kind of violence that removes you from your understanding of your ancestral self, your spiritual self, your cultural self, your social self. So to burn Babylon is to burn all of those things that is removing you from the conditions that makes you a human.
Perfect.
Really?
Perfect, yeah.
Thank you.
And just, I want to finish up on a kind of like optimistic note. I guess, yeah, like over the last like 5-6 years, this idea of Black Britishness has been kind of brought to the forefront. Books, music, exhibitions, programs, funds, all kinds of things. There'll be films, everything, right? I'm not necessarily interested in sustaining, but like, what does I guess an optimistic future look like of this work kind of continuing in different ways to you with House of Dread, the work that you do, the way you think about maybe your contribution as an individual?
I think I can like obviously just speaking from my own positionality. I think there's once again going back to the conversation about why is there this disconnect of the return, to the Caribbean and specifically Jamaican. I think I'm optimistic about the relinkings of these networks and creating more helpful creative networks, research networks that can link up the displaced roots, in our real life in a way that's functional and actually helpful and not just like under a nationalistic frame. So I think definitely like creating more of these real tangible networks across the UK and the Caribbean and I'm including West Africa within that as well. So thinking about these roots of the 500 years, of connecting.
The Black Atlantic.
The Black Atlantic, yeah. But I'm also thinking about, also the narratives as well, I think this is what's been really powerful or interesting is the multiple different ways in which emerging young people, young curators, whatever, are thinking about the narratives around Black Britishness, and the ways in which, what are the collective narratives that we can hold on to. And I think we're at a very beginning point of forming that. And I'm excited to see how that develops over the next couple of years. I think there's also something about space. We need to talk about space. There's no Black music. There's no Black culture. There's no Black things or whatever without an understanding of space. And whether that's these kind of spaces or whether that's more institution or whether that's thinking about sociability and just your everyday conviviality, and play, we need to start investing more in these ideas of space. And I think we also need to reckon with these publicly funded institutions that we're paying our taxes to publicly serve us, to be accountable to that service. And I think going back to Beyond the Bassline, this was something that I was hoping would open up, that these institutions were paying them to serve us. And so therefore, they have a responsibility to be accountable to that service of us, So I'm actually, as much as maybe there's been a bit of a heaviness, but I'm actually quite optimistic about that kind of, for me, is that conversation between possibilities and impossibilities. And I feel like we're at a very sweet spot at the moment around these possibilities.
Dr. Aleema Gray, thank you.
Thank you.